Welcome everyone. And what we're going to talk about today is it's not a very long presentation. We're going to go through some of the key points of giving an effective presentation, thinking about things like remembering your audience, how to put up slides that are useful and helpful for your audience to understand what you're talking about. We're going to talk about different types of graphics, some pitfalls, the do's and don'ts, and just kind of preparing for when things may go wrong. This is designed as more of a discussion. And so we're going to go through and talk about a few things, but feel free after each slide. There's only about 9 slides or so. We've got quite a bit of time. Feel free to, if you have something that you feel like is something that you always do, or to help out. This is a conversation. Or if maybe you've made a really bad error in the past and you had something that you learned from, those are great things also to bring up. Great. So I'm going to turn it over to Gail to get us started.
Okay, thank you. And thanks everyone for coming. I can say that I've got 30 some odd years behind me of giving good, bad, and indifferent presentations. And so I speak from some experience. And I think some real key points to start off with was really asking yourself, why am I giving this paper? And I know sometimes that has to do with, well, my supervisor told me I needed to present at this conference, or I really wanted to go to a Honolulu, and this was a way to get there. But I think we really need to sit down and think about the audience that we're speaking to, and we have varied audiences, and that will relate to the key points that I want to make for this specific audience, for this group of people. What are the key points I want to make? And then I think it's really valuable to have in the back of your mind what you would like your audience members to walk away with. If they met someone in the elevator who had just missed your talk and said, well, what did she say? Then you would be able to give the 3 key points and very easily. So you want your folks to walk away with the take-home message, the really key points that you want to discuss. What I really want to focus on with my comments, we're each going to take turns with a few slides, is this issue of audience that I think is so key to WAGE, because we're speaking to different groups. One thing that we have to remember is that we're often speaking to groups that their language is not your language. And so are you talking to a multilingual group? Are you talking with simultaneous translation? I realize I may be talking too quickly right now. You have to modify your speed. If translation is provided, you want to be aware of that. You want to make sure that you know whether that's going to happen. And sometimes you'll have simultaneous translation, which is a real burden on the translators. These people are incredibly skilled. But sometimes you'll have non-simultaneous translation, which means all of a sudden your 15-minute presentation needs to be a 7.5-minute presentation. So those are things you want to find out. Is translation going to be provided? If you're an anthropologist and you're speaking to a group that includes natural scientists and physical scientists, there are terms you can't use. There are examples that you can't use. I was reading a paper recently that had something on a Bosnian pine tree or something. I'm sorry, a Boasian, having to do with Boaz. And I didn't know. I'm not an anthropologist. I assume that most anthropologists would understand the reference. Your language has to be simplified to be inclusive. The same thing goes with education level, that you have to be aware if you're giving a talk to a group of individuals who may be very smart people, but their education level is not university education. That requires a different language too. So I really encourage people to sit down and think about who you're talking to, how many languages are involved, respect your translators who are going to have a problem, provide them, actually, if you do want to use a certain terminology, provide them ahead of time with any specific terms, because often in a discipline, a term can be translated differently than it might be in general knowledge. And then get rid of those terms that are specific, like in English, we say kick the bucket for someone who died, or can't make heads or tails if you can't understand. Those things don't translate well. And then finally, you want to be sure if there are any local protocols about presenting. And this might have to do with if certain people within a group can ask you questions, and you should be very aware of, say, elders or something, of listening to them and giving them a full chance to respond and to talk and all that. Damon, I'll turn it back to you if you want to handle discussion on this, if anyone wants to.
Sure. And one of the other things is, thinking about what's the venue that you're going to be speaking to. For example, I do a lot of workshops, and then there's also, professional papers. And in a workshop setting, oftentimes I'm welcoming a group of people to my community. I live in Anchorage. I'm a lifelong Alaskan, so I was born and raised there. My family's been there for many generations. And we, also consider those that were there originally. And so this is kind of part of that conversation is when do you do this? And I wanted to just give you a kind of a little story about why I put this example in here. And I was giving a presentation recently to open up a workshop here in Anchorage for the National Academy of Science. And as our planning team was going through the process, they realized, oh, maybe we should do a land acknowledgement. Why don't we just ask our keynote speaker to do that for us? And I was almost horrified because, asking a person who the keynote speaker was not from the region, that person was not comfortable doing that. Asking that person to come and then give that part of the talk, it was like, oh, we need to check this box. That's not a way you do this. And so what I did is I gave a kind of a welcome to our community type of talk, recognizing the Denina who had stewarded the land before, and making a connection between that to what we were going to talk about. So doing it in a very meaningful way. And so this is something that's been done recently. It's come up recently, but it shouldn't be something that's just done to check the box. It has to be done in a very meaningful way. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I was very careful in scripting exactly what I said. And so sometimes when I do these welcomes, I actually write them out as if I'm talking to an audience. And I make sure to put in where I need to move the slide. I put in examples that articulate exactly what I'm trying to say. In this conversation, for example, I was talking about adaptation, the importance of subsistence in the area. And I showed one of my favorite adaptation slides, which is called the Yule Cole, which is a spruce tree that's been put upside down into the silt of Cook Inlet that acts as a platform that people used to hunt beluga whales from, because they were not very good at kayaking, but they were interior hunters that were trying to hunt marine resources. And I was talking about adaptation. So I was using this as an example to try to talk about the care and stewardship of the ocean, all of this, and then using actual local place names to describe that and connecting it to the place. So, but I was very careful about scripting it. So that's one thing to consider. It depends on your audience, whether I'm talking to a tribal council in a community, whether I'm talking to a group like this, or if you're giving a professional paper. The other thing was, thinking about, like, when do I write this out? When do I need to write this out and make sure I get all of the words right? Versus a presentation sometimes where you just have slides and you're going to talk about those slides and just kind of doing it without having to write out your script. So those are a couple of things to think about. But back to this discussion on land acknowledgements, if you're going to do it, make sure you do it in a very meaningful way. The Anchorage Museum has a great guide for doing land acknowledgements that you can find online. And the guide was actually written by Aaron Leggett, who is a curator at the museum, and he's also the chief of Eklutna, which is it's the closest village which resides inside of Anchorage. So he has designed a guide to do things like this in a very meaningful way. And it's an excellent resource if you need it. It's at the Anchorage Museum website. So is there any conversation around that? Like, has anybody given a paper where they feel like they didn't put the right didn't do it in the right format, or they didn't meet the audience's needs, that they learned something from? Okay. Okay, let's move on to the next slide then.
Great. So we've spoken a bit about then some of your preparation and considering how you're going to speak and who you're going to speak to. And now we want to think about what you're going to show on your slides. So we have this sample slide here. That I'm just going to go through a couple of things with it, and then I'll ask a couple of questions. So let's just pretend I'm presenting at a conference and I'm talking about using presentation graphics software effectively. So, considering just what you've seen, and what are some of the things that you think may not be the best or the most appropriate with this slide? And there's a few.
And feel free to, you don't have to raise your hand. Just go ahead and unmute yourself and share.
I saw some of you chuckling at it, so.
Andre, I saw you laugh.
Yeah.
Are you all supposed to say something? I mean, I wasn't sure. Yeah,
please.
What is good about it? That's the question, right? I mean, just the combination of sound, color, and everything is just, and also I don't know, and the pattern actually very difficult to follow. So I think that's, a lot of things are wrong here. So, but the sound was most irritating, I guess.
Okay, so the sound definitely did not add anything to what the slide is trying to show, and it most definitely has distracted the audience from focusing on the content and what's being said. The photo is not overly relevant, maybe perhaps to the topic of the slide, which is graphic software or consultations with research ethic boards, which also itself has a few spelling mistakes in it. It takes a second to see it, but it's there. It's consultations with research ethics board. So there's some spelling mistakes. The figures, they aren't exactly clear either. So it has series 1, 2, and 3, but what does that mean? Maybe it would be obvious to the audience if the speaker is speaking and explaining it. Maybe not. The sound effects didn't make sense. The what the heck in the bottom right hand corner looks like a note that was left over from a previous version of the draft that should have been deleted before we got to this stage. And the picture doesn't even cover the whole slide. So visually, there's a lot going on. Listening to things, there's a lot going on. And if a speaker was actually giving a presentation like this, the audience would have a really hard time paying attention to what's being said.
But I think also colors, right?
Oh yeah.
The colors of the graphs they implying some sort of progression, but it probably isn't there. Or if it is, it's not evident. But even the colors, like the nature of them, are kind of not natural. So that's probably not good either.
And the scale doesn't make sense because the total definitely isn't the total of the three segments either. So these are just some things to consider, some things maybe not to do. But there's also things that you can do that would help. So when you're looking at your slides, make sure that the font is large enough for people to see. So maybe a size 24. You should make sure that the font is consistent Because we all know we copy and paste information in from other papers or things that we've worked on, or even different versions of your presentation. And along the way, the formatting can kind of go a little awry. We kind of like the sans serif because it looks nice. Think about the contrast between the font and the background. I don't think we really had that in the last slide with the color scheme didn't really work. It was kind of hard to see. The charts and graphics should be simple. The audience should understand what they're looking at, and it should match also with what you're saying. It's not that you can't use animation, but think about doing it minimally, and so it makes sense with what you're showing. So if you have like a list that you're trying to show in the next points, and you don't want the audience to read your whole list at the beginning, could be a good example for using some animations. And generally, also PowerPoint is the standard for these presentations. I know people use Prezi. I remember when Prezi first came out, everyone was like, oh, wow, this is super cool. And then after 2 whole panels of everybody using Prezi, it became a bit distracting also from the speaking, which again isn't to say that you can't, but it's just try and think about the standard for presentations that people generally use.
There's a couple other things. Can you go back just a second?
To the
Yeah.
slide? Yeah.
Okay. So one of the other things is you have to think about that there is a segment of the population that's colorblind.
Yeah.
And the use of colors like this is going to be very difficult for those people to pick up the differences in the different scales there. The other thing is if you look at the very bottom where it says series 1, 2, and 3, you can barely see that. And so also with the x-axis, the numbers there's also nothing there that tells you what that x-axis is. And it's also very small to read. So one of the things I do is I usually pull in a graph like this in its native format, and then I work in that graph on the presentation slide to actually adjust it so that I can make sure that everything is readable and it makes sense. And even if there's a title at the top, the graph itself should have the information you need to understand what the graph is without actually reading that top part.
I have a small comment too. Apart from the misspelling in the headline, it's quite unclear what it means. Who has these consultations and with which research ethic board? And that sort of follows up to what Devin says, that you should have all the information at a glance, and of course the headline also should tell you what you can expect from the graphic illustration.
I was going to say what Davin said, which is there's quite a percentage of the population, especially red-green colorblind among males. So you be aware of the colors you use.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's websites too that you can go to that have accessible color palettes. So if that's something that you want to consider, you can check those out as well.
And I'll underscore Karen's comment about Prezi too. It's all very fun and nice, but it's also incredibly distracting from the message, from those key points that you want to bring home to your audience. So I think the sort of the linearity of a PowerPoint is much more effective for most audience members.
So keeping some of these things in mind, we have an example now of perhaps an effective graphic slide. So this was a slide from one of my presentations that Gail informed me she enjoyed. So this is why it's here. Not because of my own reasons, but it was from a presentation I gave at the Arctic Congress in Boda in this year in 2024 about a forthcoming research a colleague and I did on border management. And so there was a lot to cover from our paper, and we couldn't incorporate everything into the presentation, let alone into the slides. So what we wanted to do was make sure that the slides just represented what I was speaking about. So in this particular case, it was about the NATO expansion that happened with Sweden and Finland joining NATO in the past couple of years. So we used one of the images from our book chapter that illustrates what we're talking about. We made sure that we put the source on it, so it was created by us, and the information on the data sources and the technology that we used to create the slide. And so from here, then I was able to just speak about the main points from this case. And yeah, so I don't know, there's different, and there's not too much text. People aren't getting distracted by reading the text and listening to me and then taking notes from from the speaker and from the slide, making sure that the things line up. So this is just one example of a graphic slide. So I'm wondering if anyone else has any examples or ideas on how they like doing it. Yeah.
And can I just add that this is, I think, one case where you don't need to follow the 24 or larger font size when you're putting your sources in. You want them there. They're really important to have, but they can be in a small font so that someone can follow up if they need to. But I just really like this slide. I thought it was so clear with the color differentiation and not too busy. And yeah.
Is there a certain format for slides that people like doing themselves that they think works?
I don't know if anybody's played with this, but in PowerPoint you can use the design mode, and it's a button on the very far right, and that will give you ideas about how to drag things around, and it will give you different ideas about how to make sure that what you're showing will come out. It's in the largest format possible. There's it puts everything kind of in a nice place. So that's something that I've used recently. You have to be online to use it. So you can't, not when you're on a plane on your way, because that's what you always do, right? You put your presentation together on the plane on the way to the meeting. So you need to do it in advance when you have actual internet. But it works really well, and I really like using it. It's really helped me format better looking presentations.
I find with the design, the one thing that it is not good for is it shrinks the font down. And so you can go back in and then enlarge all the fonts again. It gives you some really nice graphic or looks, but you have to then modify it yourself.
Correct. Yeah. And the other, a lot of my students now are using Google Slides because it's something they can easily use and then share with me to give their presentations. And you can do it in a native PowerPoint format and then upload it as a Google slide. They can go back and forth. And so that's something that's easy to use. Sometimes if you start in PowerPoint and then you switch to Google Slides, it's fairly seamless. There's a little loss of tools, but for the most part, it works really well. And I think for students especially, it's becoming a kind of a standard.
Yeah, I think that's
okay. This is mine. So, you finished giving your presentation, and now it's time for questions. And this can be an unnerving part of your presentation sometimes. I think it's really useful to sit down before you write that. Hopefully, you're not writing the paper on the plane. You've written it and practiced it a number of times. But also, you can sit back and think, what are you going to be asked? And if you consider what you might be asked, you usually get about somewhere between maybe 50 to 80% of the questions you'll imagine, and you can mentally prepare for what you would be answering. And I think that really is empowering, helpful. You also might want to consider what extra information, examples, case studies, whatever you would have liked to communicate. And so this is the kind of situation that you might be able to provide something that you really didn't have time in that 12 to 15 minutes or that 7 minutes if you've got non-simultaneous translation. Have that at your fingertips. You might even have an extra slide or two that you could go to afterwards. I've used that technique sometimes that you don't plan to show unless it comes up, but that's a possibility. You also can consider what you might want to say, even if it doesn't totally relate to the question. You can misunderstand questions, and some people do this very skillfully. Sometimes you don't understand a question. And I just put this can't make it heads or tails to remind us all that don't use those kinds of phrases because they may not translate. So what if you don't understand a question? You may ask for clarification. You may ask for rewording. You may say, I don't understand it. Or you may choose to answer it however you want to share more information. And I've seen this skillfully done too, so that you're not really answering the question. And then some people will give a different answer than what seemed to be wanted by the person who asked the question. And then sometimes they'll say, did I answer your question? That's always not such a good tactic, because then the person may say no, but that's actually used by people. If you don't know the answer to the question, you can do a number of things. You can admit that you don't know. You can say, I don't know, but maybe someone else in the room does. You can say, I don't know, but it's a really interesting question, and I will get back to you. Now, if you do that, then you should be responsible about taking the person's contact information and getting back to them. So there are different ways of handling that. We all don't know the answer to every single question. And so don't be embarrassed about that. It's just one of these things that people have great imaginations. They may ask questions that are relevant you never thought about. They may ask questions that aren't quite relevant, but and so there's different ways to deal with that too. But sit down before you give that presentation and consider how you're going to deal not only with the presentation itself, but the follow-up. And I would love to hear from students who've given papers already, but colleagues also who've dealt with this issue when you've been asked something out of the blue and you have no clue what's going on.
Well, I also think there's the question that's not really a question. It's the person who also wants to contribute to your presentation in some way. And I remember as a student that was really off-putting, because I wasn't sure what to make of it. The first time that happened to me, I'm like, oh, did I make a mistake? Was something factually wrong in my paper? Like, I don't know, did I miss something in my grand research project? And quite often after I realized this kind of happens, or can happen quite frequently, I would just thank the person for their insights, and it's something I would consider, as my project develops or something. So when you get those questions there, or more of a comment, it's okay. And it's okay to just say thank you for your comment. You don't necessarily need to respond or defend your position in that way.
Yeah. And sometimes I'll say, thank you for your comments. I appreciate your inputs. Are there any more questions? And maybe it's my age that I feel like I can get away with that now. But just like you want to redirect the audience so that hopefully what you get after that, because what you might sometimes in those situations, and I've had that happen to me recently when facilitating a panel, that people started to want to include their own comments, but what we really wanted was questions to the panel. And so what I usually do is I try to redirect people and just be polite about it, but in the best way I can, but also redirect and say, are there any more questions for our panel? Or do you have any more questions for me? Things like that. And so don't feel afraid to do that if you feel like you're getting more than one of these where people just want to, provide their own experiences or feedback, unless that's what you're after. If that's what you're after, that's fine. But if not, what you really want is people to ask you questions. Don't feel afraid to say, are there any more questions?
We should probably have a panel on facilitating or moderating, because there's lots of tricks to that too, like cutting those people off politely.
My research area is violence and masculinities. And I have that experience when I have some presentation for a local group, a local audience. There are some people who are affected. And it is very difficult to know how to come out of those situations in a presentation. Do you have some experience?
And when you say they're affected, you mean emotionally?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a difficult one to be prepared for that if you're speaking about traumatic subjects.
But when I've had people that have contributed something like that, I have just respectfully said, thank you for sharing your experience with us. And you know, we honor that. And just letting them know that they've been heard.
I guess there's also the issue of follow-up if they seem to need any kind of services. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was going to say after the presentation, you could find someone in the audience who may have who was affected, like you were saying, and you could speak with them privately after as well, to make sure they're okay.
Yeah.
I don't know whether it's relevant or not, but there is also maybe some cultural thing that people could keep in mind. I mean, we in North America seems to be nice when asking questions, participating in discussions, not necessarily the culture in other places in terms of academic culture. So, but I mean, it could feel like hostile question or comment, but I think in many cases, the remedy just to respond like, you know, like we would otherwise. Don't sort of get into that discussion or whatever it is, and just I think in some cultures it's important that your presentation is almost like a thesis defense every time, and somebody just has, you know, something to say. So at least, yeah, you might know which culture I'm referring to, and then that's you just need to be firm and answer questions by, you know, based on substance. So I think that's maybe important. Not get intimidated or sort of taken aback of the way some questions are asked.
That's a really excellent point, Andre. Yeah, that sometimes what seems to be very hostile is just a cultural way of responding to a paper and expected within that culture. That's a really good, yeah.
Or just the question is direct. There's not that, oh, thank you for blah, blah, blah. You know, it's just tell me about this or you know, something that maybe that we're not, you know.
Gerard, you had a
Yes, thank you. I would like to share a lived experience. Yeah, years and years ago, I was in a conference in Alaska, and there was in the audience someone. I was not the presenter. One of my colleagues was the presenter, and someone in the audience asked questions. Well, announced that she had a question, but it was more like a comment, and a violent comment, saying that that person who was talking about Aboriginal people should not do that because she's not of Aboriginal origin. And then she accused her to replicate the good old colonial ways of using information, etc. And it was very rough. And that colleagues, she answered very calmly, I'm sorry for what you see in my presentation. I respect your opinion, but it is not the fact. And she could have expanded her answer for a longer answer, explaining that she was actually working with Indigenous people groups, and she was doing more or less the same thing that I've been doing in my career, working on and with the questions that people are asking. And but she just refrained and just state that it is not the case, and it was enough, and it was the end of the discussion. So I think the best position in this case, where you are accused of something, it's certainly to keep your calm and answer with the truth, well, your truth, and in a very few words. And well, most of the time, and I mentioned that one, but there was several others in my path, this kind of thing. And I can tell you that myself, when it happened, I used the same strategy, and it worked very well. And the discussion was, ended there. This is what I want to share.
And you
Excellent.
can always take that off the floor then, you could actually offer to talk to the person later afterwards, one-to-one. But I think that's a really wise strategy, Gerard, to share. Thank you.
We've thought about our presentations, how we're going to prepare for it, how we're going to present, and we're all confident everything is going to go swimmingly and everything will be great and you'll be happy at the end. However, there's definitely some hiccups that can happen along the way. For example, our first 2 points here is about, when something happens to your visuals. A couple examples were, when I was still a student, I went to a conference. I followed all the instructions to make sure, things were Mac or PC compatible and what you needed to make all the connections. And then my memory stick wouldn't connect. It just wouldn't work. And for some reason, I don't know why, but we couldn't email things. It was just, I was not able to, there was no internet in the room. So everything had to be done on memory sticks. And it just wouldn't work. The computer wouldn't read it. So I had to give my presentation without my slides. So that was extremely nerve-wracking. But thankfully, as a way that I actually prepared for that was I printed out all my slides in advance along with my speaking notes. So I was able to kind of just go through the presentation, keeping in mind, if there was something that was maybe on the slide that the audience would need to find relevant, I would say, like, for example, here you could see a map, or here I would have a table showing this, just to kind of give the audience some of that context they would have missed from not having been able to see my slides. Another example was the technology worked completely fine, but the room we were in was east facing, and it was a very early morning presentation, and the sun came in and basically just, you couldn't see the screen. It was just all white. So that presentation for me went a little less well, because in that case, my slides were all graphs, where I was going to say, as you can see on the slide, and then talk about the graph. And I hadn't prepared notes in the event that you couldn't see the slide. So I had to try and explain the graphs and the data, and then what my analysis was of it. And I had to do that all on the spot, and it did not go as well. And so there was a lesson learned from that also about preparing the slides and your speaking notes, and making sure if something like that was to happen again, that you're able to kind of move forward without getting caught up in it. And the same thing can happen. The technology could go out at the Arctic Congress that first morning. The internet wasn't working at one of the hotels where the sessions were, which affected some people's slides and presentations. So there's things that you can't control, but if you just kind of prepare a bit in advance, make sure you've got, like I said, try and have some notes, or what your the main points that you want to cover are, that can be really helpful. And then another hiccup could be with the instructions for your panel. You're told you have 10 minutes, 12 minutes, 20 minutes, however long. And then the person or people before you kind of go over, and then there's a hard deadline for the end of that session. So maybe when it comes to your time, you've only got 10 minutes instead of 15. So what do you do? So this is where knowing what the key points of what you want the audience to take away. So maybe you know that you'll only show 3 out of your 10 slides, or you'll only focus on a key point from each slide, and then try and bring it all together into the conclusion, or that summary could be a way to get around that. So does anyone have any experience or advice or on any of these?
Yeah. So one thing that I want to bring up is, recently a lot of discussions have been more of these lightning talks, which is like, share something really quick instead of giving a full 20-minute or 30-minute presentation like that used to be the case. And the idea is that I have my students do this in class. They have to present their research papers, and I just want them to do it because I want them to have experience doing this. And I asked them, like, why did you pick this? Tell me a couple of key things from your paper, and then tell me something interesting that you want to share. So be prepared for something like that. So if you're giving a presentation, a couple of things that I always do is, I joked about writing it on the plane on the way there. I never do that. I always do it in advance. And I also have something in paper because just in case something happens that I can get up there and talk. This is somewhat of a problem because some people are auditory learners. They learn by hearing, and some people are visual learners and they learn by seeing. And so you want both. You want to have that talk, but you want to have something on the screen so that for those people that learn better that way. So some key bullet points or an image or something that really tells about what you're talking about. But what happens if none of that works and you really have to talk? So you have to be careful in thinking it through, like, how do I explain this well to somebody that may have a hard time with me talking? So you want to consider that. You want it to be very clear, and have your key points that you wanted to get across and your key conclusion. And that key conclusion should be something interesting. I also have a little something I try to do partway through a few times in a presentation is something where it kind of brings people back to the conversation. And that's one thing I wanted to mention is that, it might be something that's like slightly funny or something like that. What it does is it refocuses people back to your presentation. So if you have, like, as you're going through a presentation and you're giving your talk, like, you want something that is something that people will be like, what did he say? And it actually draws people back in to the presentation, so that they continuously have those throughout the presentation, that it keeps them interested in listening to what you're trying to say. So, and as far as this really helps because I gave a presentation at the Alaska Anthropological Association one time, and I scheduled my presentation for exactly 20 minutes. And the person in front of me went on for 40 minutes and nobody cut him off. And so when it came time for my presentation, I got 5 minutes in and they told me, you have 2 minutes left. And so I was a little befuddled. But what I did is I tried to think, okay, what are the key points that I want to get across as far as this paper goes? And that's what I did is I just covered like 2 or 3 more things. I did take 5 minutes, not 2 minutes. But I made sure I got my 20-minute presentation down into 10 minutes. Everybody understood what I wanted to convey. And I did it in a way that made sure that if anybody wanted to follow up with me afterwards, they could. Because I was trying to actually get input. It was the key point of what I was trying to do. And so that was, just be prepared for that. And I totally agree that these things happen. And that is kind of my last point is don't always plan for the maximum amount of time. Because as humans, we want to go on and talk about things and expand on them because it's interesting for us. And that's why we did the project in the first place. And we're excited about it. We're excited to share. So think through like, okay, I have 20 minutes. Let's just give about 10, 12 minutes of information here because I know I'm going to talk too long. So, think about it that way too. And then if you end a little early, that's fine. You can have more time for conversation. Do we have any other examples of times where you've given something or a presentation and lessons you've learned?
Well, I might share one experience, which luckily is more than 3 decades ago, or almost. It was one of my first presentations, and to be sure that I would get through everything I wrote. Well, basically, I guess I wrote an article and thus unwillingly copied the professors that I had at the university. That's half a century ago. And that ended up in a disaster. The session chair was very kind and let me speak. twice as long time. So I ended the article, read up, but just to say that I think that was one of the lessons that taught me to be prepared, and to be prepared without having to read something, but just comments your slides and highlights the state. But I know there are different ways, and I appreciate what you said, Devin, about when you're in a particular place and you're going to introduce and to welcome. That's a different thing, because you need to be very exact there. But when it comes to presentation, it has been, the experience was extremely bad, and I think not least for the audience. But I've learned to sort of limit myself to being dependent on what I wrote, but also at the same time to prevent more disasters, having everything printed out, or the slides printed out, if you get into trouble, like you've been talking about. Thank you.
So just to reiterate some of what we've already said, and underline a few other things, it's really good to know what you're getting into in terms of what the time is. Always know whether it's 12 or 15 minutes or 10 minutes. I think this advice about planning a couple minutes less than you're actually given is really good. And be ready for the situation where the moderator does not follow instructions and cut the 3 people off in front of you, and you end up with less time than you thought you would. Be ready for knowing whether you're going to have simultaneous translation or non-simultaneous translation, if translation is being provided, and figure that into your timing. Don't go over time. It's disrespectful. And to make sure that you're not going over time, even if other people do it, practice. So I think it's really important to give your paper a few times. You can do this to colleagues. You can do it to the mirror in your apartment or in the hotel room, but know that your paper is 12 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever. Some of us can give papers really well without writing down the text, and reading them can be very boring. Some of them are better off with the text pretty much verbatim. I find that I would rather hear a well-read paper, one that's been practiced, and therefore there's eye contact and it's read at a good speed, than having someone go off on 14 different tangents. Some of my colleagues are incredibly talented at speaking with minimal notes, others aren't. So know your limitations, and your skills will develop over time too. And then finally, I think it's really useful to give your contacts. If someone wants to follow up with you, encourage them to do so. Encourage them to ask you so you can give that extra information. But if you do that, follow up. So I think those are the main issues that I wanted to end up with. And I think, back to making sure you have a good, clear conclusion of your major points. If you're using PowerPoint, have that as a slide, have it as a slide that you've printed out in case PowerPoint doesn't work. And you can always fall back on that, so that if you only have 5 minutes instead of your allotted 15, then you can at least go to that and you've got that right there in your hands, ready to comment on.
Gerard had something in the chat also. If these days it's common to do an online type of workshop, make sure you check the time zone.
Exactly.
Yeah, but I would agree with don't go over time. It's especially for North Americans, as we are very polite, and we try to be polite. Maybe Canadians are a little more polite than us Americans, but we try to be polite to our colleagues. And so yeah, make sure you stay within your time, and which I think is our last one. So the contacts are very important, and having people follow up with you. And I would always encourage you to put this on a slide that will be up for at least a couple of minutes or so that somebody can take it, so that somebody can take your information down. I often do this on the slide that I know will be there for questions. But if it's a really quick presentation and we might only have like there might not be any questions, or we're moving on to a panel or something like that, I'll try to put this contact information on an earlier slide so that it doesn't get erased right away, because you want people to follow up with you afterwards. And the other thing is, we originally had on this not just thank you, but thank you in various languages. Know the protocol in the area where you are. So, for example, I live on Dena'ina territory, and in Dena'ina it's Chan, but we typically don't say that here. Like you would never say that at a presentation or something like that. So I did not put this on here. But if I'm in Southeast Alaska, where it's a more homogenous culture of Clickit, and it's embedded in the larger Euro-American culture there, to say gonoshish at the end of a presentation is typically pretty standard, even if you're a non-Clickit person. So, know the protocol in the place where you are. In some places it's not really appropriate, in other places it is. But just a simple thank you is always just appreciated. And make sure that, like I said, that your contact information is there, because you never know who's going to follow up with you afterwards.
We'd love to hear from some of the younger early career scholars about their experiences or questions.
Yeah, thank you guys again for coming here. I guess one quick question. I guess kind of the opposite of if you find yourself going too long. If you find yourself kind of running too short and you have like a block of time that you have to fill up, do you think it's best to try to just go slower, just kind of like think of more examples, or just to kind of like tighten up and just leave more room? Or I don't know what y'all think.
I think there's two ways you can play that. And one is, like you say, circle back and give a few more examples. The other is to pretend like it was purposeful and say, I've left a little time for more discussion and questions, and then invite your audience. So if you find all of a sudden you're done in 7 minutes rather than 10, you could make it look intentional.
And that's something that happens to me too when I do my practice at home. I time it out like 15 minutes on the dot. I'm great. And then I get there, and then maybe the nerves or the excitement of the situation sets in, and I end up speaking faster than I practiced. So my 10 minutes becomes 8. So I usually just when I start to, or when I feel like maybe the time's going too quickly, while I'm speaking, I just try and slow it down a bit and think about my pace also. Is this the reason maybe I'm going a bit too short as well? And then try and slow it down, because if I'm speaking too fast, again, people maybe aren't. I might be speaking too fast for the audience to take in everything I'm trying to explain.
Yeah, and slowing down is a really good idea, especially in a context like this where we have interpreters on, and they will very much appreciate you slowing down.
I used to write slow in big letters across each page of my presentation, because I tend to speak at about 150 RPM.
It's a good tip for the notes. Thank you.
Yeah, and also, Jake, if you write your presentation, say it's a very scripted one, write it like you're talking to somebody. And also put in areas where, like, even give yourself little cues, like look up, things like that. Look at your audience, things like that. So I often do that. I'll do that when I have to give a very scripted paper, is I will like put where the slides need to change. And during those transitions, I'll usually do it at a place where I could look up it, because it's between a point or something like that, and I could look at my audience. You want to keep looking at your audience, reading the audience. Are they interested? Do I need to say something to bring their interest back? Something like that. So just, I guess my dogs get tired of me listening to my presentations when I'm practicing. It's like, practice, go through it and make sure that you're speaking slowly, that it's, and the way you've written it is a way that you will talk to an audience. You're not saying something that is actually supposed to be actually read.
That takes practice.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you all.
Any other questions, especially from students, things that you've learned?
Yes.
Yeah.
Je vais m'adresser en français. Tout d'abord, merci beaucoup je suis contente d'être parmi vous. Moi, je suis très jeune au niveau de la collaboration dans une recherche en particulier qui concerne les pensionnats autochtones au Québec. Alors, vous savez, c'est un sujet très délicat. Et puis, quand on fait la présentation du projet de recherche, euh, c'est super important pour moi parce que ça me concerne. Je fais partie d'une Première Nation. Et puis, c'est un sujet qui est lourd, qui est sensible. Il faut être très prudent dans la façon de le faire parce que il faut être clair. C'est un peu dans ce que vous dites, tout se connecte, là, tu sais. Qu'est-ce qu'on s'attend au niveau des questionnements, puis tout ça. C'est sûr que pour l'avoir déjà fait avec des ex-survivants présents lors de présentations, quand il s'agit de la période de questions, ben c'est toujours difficile parce que des fois, ils veulent partager pas nécessairement poser des questions sur la recherche, mais ils veulent partager sur leur expérience, puis c'est pas évident de baliser ça puis de leur dire, tu sais, écoutez, merci pour votre partage. Puis en plus, le temps. Quand c'est un aîné qui parle chez nous, là, tu coupes pas la parole. Tu comprends? C'est des façons de faire. Euh, Moi, je serais jamais capable de couper la parole à un aîné. Quand je fais une présentation, je l'écoute du début jusqu'à la fin. Alors, l'enjeu du temps est souvent très présent. Puis, c'est quelque chose qu'il faut prévoir aussi dans nos présentations par rapport à cette recherche-là. Puis, en tout cas, j'ai vraiment beaucoup pris de notes là, par rapport à votre présentation. Je trouve ça très intéressant, puis ça me donne des pistes aussi sur quoi faire attention. Puis, il y a aussi tu sais, au début, quand on fait les présentations dans les communautés autochtones, souvent, les chercheurs qui viennent dans nos communautés, on a comme une petite réticence à collaborer, à écouter, parce que souvent, ils sont venus, puis ils sont repartis avec les résultats, puis ils sont jamais revenus, comprenez? Alors maintenant, c'est de briser ça aussi, là, de rebâtir ce lien-là, que ça a sa raison d'être, cette collaboration-là qu'on fait présentement avec l'Université Laval. Moi, j'y crois. Et puis, c'est une collaboration qui est saine, qui est vraiment respectueuse. Puis, c'est de même que je l'amène dans les communautés, ce projet-là, en disant ça, tu sais. On doit se refaire confiance. Puis, c'est pas pour rien qu'on fait un projet de recherche. Pourquoi qu'on fait un projet de recherche? Qu'est-ce que ça va nous donner, ce projet de recherche-là? Tu sais? Fait que ça aussi, c'est important de le mentionner parce que ça va avoir un impact sur nous, sur nos générations futures, sur tu sais, plusieurs choses. Fait qu'il y a tout ça qu'il faut rebâtir, reconstruire. Puis je trouve ça beau. Malgré le sujet très, très difficile et sensible, mais il faut le faire. Tu sais, moi, je suis de celle-là qui croit à la réconciliation, oui, mais à la guérison aussi qui part par la connaissance de la vérité. Puis pour la connaître, la vérité, ben, il faut faire cette recherche-là, il faut faire des recherches, il faut aller dans les archives, faut mentionner, il faut les partager, il faut les... Alors, moi, c'est ça, c'est vraiment un privilège d'être avec vous cet après-midi, puis je suis vraiment contente.
Just a short comment. I had the same experience with that Karen testified about by making some presentation on this very project. I can tell you, even if we are well prepared, not only we have these interventions from the people that change the course of what we plan, because it's integrated in the way we are prepared. But the most important point for us is to keep our courage and our confidence, because it's very hard to talk about that. Very, very difficult. And when we start that project, I told to our collaborator, including Karine, that myself, I would select what slides I would comment, because there are some that I just cannot, because it's too hard for me, I have difficulty to talk because it's too sensitive. Yeah, that's it. It happens.
I wanted to mention one other thing. You are talking about two issues that I hear, and one is the sensitivities, and that is a really important issue. But the other is also just the location of where you're presenting. And academic conferences usually have these strict time rules. But if one's talking in a community, hopefully those go away. And I also wanted to just share a quick story about a former graduate student who was presenting her thesis results back into the Indigenous community where she worked. And she talked for several minutes, and then an elder interrupted her and got up and told a 10-minute story. And I should mention that a lot of community members came, including classrooms of kids. And when he finished, he sat down, and then she continued his presentation. And he did this again later on. And because it was not a time-sensitive issue, because we were making sure that there was time for everything to happen, this could happen. And it was really important. And I always cry at this point, because that elder passed away 2 weeks later. And the information he shared with the kids there, with the students, with the other people there, would have been not shared. You can't do that in a 20-minute per person presentation. So when you're speaking in communities, you really need to be, again, cognizant of the protocols. There should not be time limits. Elders should be given the floor. They should be given the floor for as long as they take the floor multiple times. And this turned me against the whole idea of thesis presentations in communities where there's a time scripted kind of situation that you have to follow an order of questionnaires. So I think you bring up for me, a really important cognizant issue.
And sometimes you have to be prepared for that. We have these workshops or conferences in Southeast Alaska, for example, where it's a mix of academics coming to present their information and community members in the audience. And so we do have elders that will stand up and give a short give a short talk on their experience, and they want to, and there are younger people in the audience, exactly, and they want to make sure that this information is conveyed. And so, we just like Gail said, we have to prepare for time like that to take place. And maybe that means that you don't finish your presentation, or you just, give a few key points at the end. But you have to prepare for that and be respectful of that. And I think some of the things you talked about is, it goes back to when somebody says something that's difficult and they want to share, that you have to just honor that and let them know that you honor that you honor the fact that they shared with you. I think that's something that's really important. And also that we often call researchers mosquitoes because they come in the summer and they buzz around and ask lots of questions, and then they disappear. And so, we try now to not do that. If we're going to come, we go back to a community, we present to a council, a tribal council, we present to the community. That those are very different events. And we have to be prepared for that. And we have to be prepared that it's more of a conversation instead of a presentation. So what we're presenting here for students today is really about academia and trying to present at a conference. But now more than ever, we need to also spend time going back to the places where we're doing the research and sharing what we learned and having a conversation. And those type of events need to have more time built in for that conversation to take place and sharing to take place. So thank you for bringing that up. We just have a few minutes left. Is there anything else, or we can always give people a few minutes of their day back? Okay.
Moi,
Well,
j'ai une question. J'ai une question.
okay.
J'ai noté une question pendant que vous parliez de, attendez un peu, des supports visuels. Vous avez parlé du PPD, PowerPoint, comment que c'est efficace. Mais quand on présente des cartes interactives dans notre présentation, ça fonctionne-tu, ça, dans les PowerPoint? Ou, tu sais, Gérard, Pamela, elle utilise ça dans ses présentations, les cartes interactives, puis c'est bien aussi, là?
My experience with that is that it doesn't work because she is using another software. What
Ben,
I
on
know
pourrait
is
pas.
that we can integrate some links to other material, but then you have to have the internet available, or Gail or whoever around the room, maybe Jake or Laura.
We had an incredibly powerful presentation by, I think it was Pamela Colombo last year at the ASM, using some some more animated visuals of maps. And was it Pamela? So I think, these things can be used very talentedly, but they also can distract. So it's not to say that you shouldn't use other platforms.
Ouais.
If you know the venue where you're going, if you're able to find out if you can connect with your own computer that has that software, you might be able to do it. But if you have to use the conference provided software, it might not work. And then as you were saying, if you have to connect to the internet, there's a possibility the internet might not work, like happened at this conference in the summer. So it may disrupt your plan for your presentation. But if you're able to connect in the internet and you have the internet, then wonderful.
One thing I do is I run through it what I would like to say and demonstrate, and then I take screenshots and then embed those in the presentation. So you're not actually using the software, you're showing how it can be used through just taking a screenshot of what it would look like on your computer. And I've done this with different tools that I'm demonstrating. For example, we built a tool to map harvest and use areas for wild resources, and I showed how the tool is used, but I just took pictures of what it looks like as you're using the tool. Does that make sense? Yeah. So you don't have to rely on the internet, but people can actually see what you're doing.
Merci. Merci beaucoup.
Well, yeah, thank you all for being here. And thanks to Karen and Gail for putting this together. This was fun.